The Han Empire. Under the Han Dynasty, Chinese social institutions evolved into more complex forms than had been the case in past eras. The emergence of a free peasantry resulted in a strengthening of the nuclear family, which now became the prevailing social unit throughout the countryside. Although the joint family, the linear descendant of the clan system in the Zhou dynasty, continued to hold sway in some areas, notably in the south. Under the Han, women continued to play a secondary role in society, although they frequently exercised considerable influence within individual households. Ban Zhao, a prominent historian of the period and a woman whose own career has an exception to the rule, described that role as follows: to be humble, yielding, respectful, and reverential, to put herself after others. These qualities are those exemplifying woman's low and humble estate. To retire late and rise early, not to shirk exertion from dawn to dark. This is called being diligent. To behave properly and decorously in serving her husband, to be serene and self-possessed, shunning jests and laughter. This is called being worthy of continuing the husband's lineage. If a woman possesses the above-mentioned three qualities, then her reputation shall be excellent. The vast majority of Chinese continue to live in rural areas, but the number of cities, mainly at the junction of rivers and trade routes, was on the increase. The largest was the imperial capital of Changyang, which was located adjacent to the old capital of Xianyang, and soon became one of the great cities of the ancient world, rivaling that of Rome in magnificence. The city covered a total area of nearly 16 square miles and was enclosed by a 12-foot earthen wall surrounded by a moat. 12 gates provided entry into the city, and 8 major avenues ran east-west, north, or north-south. East Avenue was nearly 150 feet wide. A center strip in each avenue was reserved for the imperator, or emperor, whose palace and guardians occupied nearly half of the southern and central parts of the city. Concerning religion and culture, the Han Dynasty's adoption of Confucianism as the official philosophy of the state did not have much direct impact on the religious beliefs of the Chinese people. Although official sources sought to flesh out the scattered metaphysical references in the Confucian canon with a more coherent cosmology, the pantheon of popular religion was still peopled by local deities and spirits of nature, some connected with popular Taoism. Sometime in the 1st century CE, however, a new salvationist faith appeared on the horizon. Merchants from Central Asia carrying their wares over the Silk Road brought the Buddhist faith to China for the first time. At first, its influence was limited, as no Buddhist text was translated into Chinese from the original Sanskrit until the 5th century CE. But the terrain was ripe for the introduction of a new religion into China, and the first Chinese monks departed for India shortly after the end of the Han Dynasty. Cultural attainments under the Han tended in general to reflect traditional forms, although there was considerable experimentation with new forms of expression. In literature, for example, and poetry, as well as philosophical essays, they all continued to be popular, but historical writing became the primary form of literary creativity. Historians such as Sima Qian, and Ban Gu, the dynasty's official historian and the older brother of the historian Ban Zhao, wrote works that became models for later dynastic histories. Again, that's from historians such as Sima Qian and Ban Gu. They wrote works, and these historical works combined political and social history with biographies of key figures. Like so much literary work in China, their primary purpose was moral and political, in order to explain the underlying reasons for the rise and fall of individual human beings and dynasties. Paintings, often in the form of wall frescoes, became increasingly popular, although little has survived the ravages of time. In the plastic arts, iron was steadily replacing bronze as the medium of choice. Less expensive to produce, iron was better able to satisfy the growing popular demand during a time of increasing economic affluence. The trend towards reduced expenditures was also evident in the construction of imperial mausoleums. Qin Shi Huangdi's ambition and his effort to provide for his immortality became a model for his successors during the Han Dynasty, although apparently on a somewhat more modest scale. In the year 1990, Chinese workers discovered a similar underground army for a Han emperor of the 2nd century BCE. Like the imperial guard of the first Qin emperor, the underground soldiers were buried in parallel pits and possessed their own weapons, as well as individual facial features. But they were smaller, only 1/3 the height of the average human adult, and were armored with wooden weapons and dressed in silk clothing. Now decayed, of course, but a burial pit nearby indicated that as many as 10,000 workers, probably slaves or prisoners, died in the process of building the emperor's mausoleum, which took an estimated 10 years in order to construct. Concerning the decline and fall of the Han Dynasty, in the year 9 CE, the reformist official Wang Mang, who was troubled by the plight of the peasants, seized power and from the Han court and declared the foundation of the Xin, or New Dynasty. The empire had been crumbling for decades. As frivolous or depraved rulers amused themselves with the pleasures of court life, the power and influence of the central government began to wane, and the great noble families filled the vacuum, amassing vast landed estates and transforming free farmers into tenants. Wang Mang tried to confiscate the great estates, restore the ancient well-field system, and abolish slavery. In so doing, however, he alienated powerful interests who conspired to overthrow him. In the year 23 CE, beset by administrative chaos and a collapse of the frontier defenses, Wang Mang was killed in a coup d'état. For a time, a strong leadership revived some of the glory of the early Han. Chinese historians refer to the period after the Wang Mang revolt as the latter Han Dynasty. The court did attempt to reduce land taxes and carry out land resettlement programs. The growing popularity of nutritious crops like rice, wheat, and soybeans, along with the introduction of new crops such as alfalfa and grapes, helped boost food production, but the great landed families' firm grip on land and power continued. Weak rulers were isolated within their imperial chambers and dominated by eunuchs and other powerful court insiders. Official corruption and the concentration of land in the hands of the wealthy led to widespread peasant unrest. One Chinese source reported with bitterness the conditions of the time. The houses of the powerful are compounds where several hundreds of ridge beams are linked together. Their fertile fields fill the countryside. Their slaves throng in thousands, and their military dependents can be counted in tens of thousands. Their boats, carts, and merchants are spread throughout the 4 quarters. Their stocks of goods held back for speculation fill up the principal cities. Their great mansions cannot contain their precious stones and treasure. The upland valleys cannot hold their horses, cattle, sheep, and swine. Their elegant apartments are full of seductive lads and lovely concubines. Singing girls and courtesans are lined up in their deep halls. The Han also continue to have problems with the Xiongnu beyond the Great Wall to the north. Professional armies recruited from among non-Chinese peoples along the periphery of the empire proved to be unreliable in both performance and loyalty. After attempts to pacify the Xiongnu leaders through negotiations failed to resolve the situation, Han rulers turned once again to military force. The threat from the north did not abate until the end of the 1st century CE, when the alliance among the various nomadic groups fractured into disunity. The respite proved to be short-lived, however, as raids on Chinese territory continued intermittently to the end of the dynasty, sometimes reaching almost to the gates of the capital city itself. Buffeted by insurmountable problems within and without, in the late 2nd century BCE, the Han Dynasty entered a period of inexorable decline. The population, which had been estimated at about 60 million in China's first census in the year 2 CE, had shrunk to less than 1/3 that number 200 years later. In the early 3rd century, the dynasty was finally brought to a close when power was seized by Cao, a general known to later generations as one of the main characters in the famous Chinese epic, The Romance of the Three Kingdoms. But Cao was unable to consolidate his power, and China entered a period of almost constant anarchy and internal division, compounded by invasions by northern tribal peoples. The next great dynasty did not arise until the beginning of the 7th century, 400 years later. A comparison of Rome and China. At the beginning of the first millennium CE, two great empires, the Roman Empire in the west and the Han Empire in the east, dominated large areas of the world. Although there was little contact between them, the two empires exhibited some remarkable similarities. Both lasted for centuries, and both were extremely successful in establishing centralized control. Both built elaborate systems of roads in order to rule efficiently and relied on provincial officials, and especially on towns and cities for local administration. In both empires, settled conditions led to a high level of agricultural production that sustained large populations, estimated at between 50 and 60 million in each empire. Although both empires expanded into areas with different languages, ethnic groups, and ways of life, they managed to extend their legal and political institutions, their technical skills, and their languages throughout their empires. The Roman Empire and the Han Empire also had similar social and economic structures as well. The family stood at the heart of the social structure, and the male head of the family was all-powerful. The family also inculcated the values that helped make the empire strong, such as duty, courage, obedience, and discipline. The wealth of both societies also depended on agriculture. Although a free peasantry provided a backbone of strength and stability in each empire, wealthy landowners were able to gradually convert the free peasants into tenant farmers, and thereby ultimately to undermine the power of the imperial governments. Of course, there were also significant differences among these empires. Merchants were more highly regarded and allowed more freedom in Rome than they were in China. One key reason for this difference is that whereas many inhabitants of the Roman Empire depended to a considerable degree on the commerce to obtain such staples as wheat, olives, wine, cloth, and timber, the vast majority of Chinese were subsistence farmers whose needs, when they were supplied, could normally be met by the local environment. As a result, there was undoubtedly less social mobility in China than in Rome, and many Chinese peasants spent their entire lives without venturing far beyond the village gate. Another difference is that over the 400 years of the empire's existence, Chinese imperial authority was far more stable. With a more cohesive territory and a strong dynastic tradition, the Chinese rulers could easily pass on their authority to other family members. In contrast, in the Roman Empire, political instability was a chronic problem, at least in some periods. Although Roman imperators were accorded divine status by the Roman Senate after death, ascension to the Roman imperial throne depended less on solid dynastic principles and more on pure military force. Both empires were periodically beset by invasions of nomadic peoples. The Han dynasty was weakened by the incursions of the Xiongnu, and the Western Roman Empire eventually collapsed in the face of incursions by the Germanic peoples. Yet, although the Han dynasty collapsed, the Chinese imperial tradition, along with the class structure and set of values that sustained that tradition, survived, and the Chinese empire, under new dynasties, would continue into the 20th century as a single political entity. In contrast, however, the Roman Empire in the West collapsed and lived on only as an idea. Next, we will cover the Americas. And so civilizations in the Americas.